if somebody said, that's mine, and if you put your foot down there, I'll kill you. And he had the right legally to do so. I'm trying to put some ideas in your head because it's important if we to understand what has happened to these people and how it comes to us. Now, this is the mentality. So now here you come. You one of, well, never mind the free land. As Columbus said, 300 miles out, they could smell the forest, the fresh air, the stuff, whatnot. Man, this is some place, because you could then see twigs and stuff. You knew land was not far. Now you come up, and here come these people down to see you. And all you can see is wall-to-wall land. And you just come from a place where you can't own a square inch. And here are these quote-unquote, as you think, simple people who rest. Y'all come on in. What you want? Given the cultural history going back for the 5,000 years and the belief and how they had treated each other, I put it to you, my colleagues and friends, could it have been otherwise for the indigenous people here? Could it have been otherwise for us, our African ancestors? No. Because in order for them to have responded in kind to the kind treatment they got here and there, they would have had to have been a different kind of people. Let me read you a little bit of what Columbus says, so you'll be taking my word. There's a letter back here somewhere. And you see already, the indigenous people are thinking friendship, etc., etc. Here, the letter of Columbus describing the result of his first voyage, page 191. I won't read you the whole thing, but get the same. Sir, since I know that you will be pleased, it's back to the king, right? Be pleased at the great victory with which our Lord has crowned my voyage. You hear this? These people give him hospitality, and he say, what? I got a great victory because I'm taking this. I'm taking it. With which our Lord has crowned my voyage. I write this to you, from which you will learn how in 33 days I passed from the Canary Island to the Indies with the fleet which the most illustrious king and queen our sovereign gave to me. There I found very many islands filled with innumerable people, and I have taken possession of them all for their highnesses. Now ain't that balls? This has got 100 men. I have taken it all. And I've done this by proclamation, with the royal standard unfurled, and no opposition was offered to me. To the first island which I found. Now, how much? There are millions of people standing there watching him, but he's discovering something. Yeah, I found this. Oh, you found that? Okay. I've been here all the time, but you found it. You discovered it. To the first island which I found, I gave the name San Salvador, in remembrance of the divine majesty who had marvelously bestowed all this. The Indians call it Cunahani. To the second, I gave the name, the island of Santa Maria de Concepcion. To the third, Fernandina, and to the fourth, Isabella. To the fifth island, Juana. And so each received from me a new name. At no time does this man say to one of these indigenous people, what do y'all call this place? Did it ever occur to him to ask that question, y'all? No. No. When I came to Juana, I followed its coast to the westward, and I found it to be so extensive that I thought it must be the mainland, the province of Cathay. He was nowhere near India or China, but nevertheless that. And since there were neither towns nor villages on the seashore, but small hamlets only, with the people of which I could not have speech, because they all fled immediately, I went forward on the same course, thinking that I could not fail to find great cities and towns. At the end of many leagues, seeing that there were no change, and that the coast was bearing me northward, which I wished to avoid, since winter was already approaching, and I proposed to make from it to the south. And as moreover the wind was carrying me forward, I determined not to wait for a change in the weather, and retraced my path as far as a remarkable harbor known to me. From that point I sent 2 men inland to learn if there was a king or great city. You don't claim the land. But you want to know if there's a king. Well, if there's a king, wouldn't he have control? But never mind that. Right. They traveled 3 days' journeys, finding an infinity of small hamlets and people without number, but nothing of importance. Now listen to this. I understand sufficiently from other Indians whom I had already taken. Now he's using the verb to take in the sense of capture. That this land was nothing but an island. I therefore followed its course eastward for 107 leagues to the point where it ended. From that point I saw another island distant about 18 leagues from the first to the east, and to it I set out at once, and he gave the name Hispaniola, and that is the land which the indigenous folks call Haiti, or High Mountain, which we today call Haiti. Now this is this man talking on his first voice. You can see clearly, not by what somebody said in theory, this is the thing that he brought here. Now this was the beginning. We find that from that point, now the Spaniards and the Portuguese were light stuff, because they were not Germanic like the Anglo-Saxons, etc., and the French. By the time, now while all this was going on, the English, of course, was like 200 years behind, because they were busy having their own wars, fighting for their own among themselves, the 100-Year War, etc., the Wars of the Roses, and the English Civil War, and all this garbage of slaughtering themselves. So by the time that Drake went out and robbed the Spanish treasure fleet, which of course the Spaniard was already beating out of the hides of the indigenous people here, they were way behind. But the Brits, being a lot more bloodthirsty than their colleagues, the Spaniards, they were fast studied. Within, they first came here 1585, as you know, Walter Raleigh went in, of course, Roanoke Island. That failed. Jamestown came later, but with the beginning of Jamestown, 1607, from then on it was hell for everybody. The indigenous people, and of course very quickly as the African became in, because we were here coming, few of us with the Spaniards. But we see clearly, if you want to argue, and these people like to tell you, Mr. Clinton and them, about what peace-loving people they are. But I've heard people say that the English or the Anglo-Saxon or Germanic people have the greatest gift for war that the world has ever known. And I would argue that the history would show us that what they would prefer doing. In other words, in the last, since the beginning of quote-unquote Christianity, or AD, there has been no period of more than 5 years of which the English or Germanic-speaking people have not been fighting or slaughtering somebody. The folks who they inherit, these people here, are even worse. There's not a neighbor that the United States of America has not beat on, whether it be Grenada, whether it be St. Lucia, whether it be Cuba, Central America, etc., etc. And they're always doing it for these people own good. And in the meantime, you're slaughtering domestic people, you're bringing in other Africans, etc., and none of this is your fault. Now, as we look at the indigenous people, in the beginning as we got here, it would have been, again, it's a question of lost opportunities. It would have been a lot easier. But one of the flaws for us to survive, but we very quickly, in general, took the same attitude toward indigenous people as our masters did. They, in turn, took the same attitude towards us as our masters did. So in general, the two most exploited, abused folks on the ground never really got together in the way they could have. And it's interesting, In the cases, the relatively few cases where they did get together, I came from the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Seminoles, where they were able to come together and work with each other, they were able to prevail, at least temporarily, with the Europeans. In the beginning, going back in the 18th century, we know early the 17th century, the New England people, what they like, the other thing about these folks and their semantics, they always lay it on somebody else. This thing they call King Philip's War. We have to be careful about these things, because it wasn't King Philip's War. After all, whose land was it? It was King Philip's and his people's land. Their version, of course, since the indigenous people were not literate, so your version is that these folks came and attacked you, and out of fear, ignored treaties. What treaties? How the hell do you make a treaty for my land? You saw already that you had no land where you came from. You were a peasant and serf, and that's what you remained, wiping your sleeves on it. It's very important we understand this, because we need to put people in perspective. But for the most part, and we'll touch on that again maybe, for the most part, during the 300 years of contact with indigenous people, and because of that element of hospitality, the relationships or non-relationship between us indigenous people are largely examples of missed opportunities. And when you begin to look at it in terms of, as we said, about quote unquote impeachment, if you were going to quote impeach or try presidents on the grounds of doing inhuman or illegal things, then there would not have been one president up to the time we speak who would not have been thrown out on his or her heir. Because let us go back and look at, not even dealing with the so-called colonial period of English, but if you look at the period from 1776 to 1865, we find, as was stated in your flyer, 15 of the first 40-some presidents were all slave owners. Let me just give you a list of them, so you say, I won't say I give it to you and deny. This is from a book, Presidential Saints and Sinners, by Thomas Bailey. And here's what he has here. I'll just read you some of the people off the front. George Washington, master. John Adams didn't have any, he was president. He's the second one. Third one, Thomas Jefferson, slave master, Virginian. Followed by James Madison, Virginian, slave master. Followed by James Monroe, Virginian and North Carolinian, slave master. Followed by John Quincy Adams, like his father, didn't own slaves. And then by one of the great slave and Indian haters and killers of all time, Andrew Jackson, slave master, Indian hater, and slaughterer. Martin Van Buren, a New Yorker. Now bear in mind, just because these folks did not own slaves does not mean they didn't support the system or the rights of the masters to be sacrosanct in their property as slaves. Then we go to William Henry Harrison, another slave owner. John Tyler, another Virginian slave owner. James K. Polk, another one. Zachary Taylor, another one. Millard Fillmore and Franklin Pierce, we're not saying these were New Englanders, and James Buchanan, but they went along with the system. Abraham Lincoln tried it, but it didn't work. Andrew Johnson tried to set the clock back, but it didn't work. Now we come down to Ulysses Grant. So now this ended the whole period of them being able to support or not support slavery. But as far as the indigenous people that we're talking about, the pain was just beginning, because William Henry Harrison made his reputation as a what? Indian fighter. What about Andrew Jackson? Indian fighter. What about Zachary Taylor? James Polk? Same. Now, when we come down, and John Tyler, when we come down to all the way down to William Howard Taft, 1919 to 13, they are still fighting indigenous people, ripping off their land, etc. So even though they couldn't fight except for us, we watch it now. Very interesting thing happened. Mr. Howard Shane, what happens at the end of, one of the things, I don't know if you all are aware of this, but this wonderful man that we call Abe Lincoln, there's so many of the great emancipator, which of course he was not, the largest hanging in the history of this country was done and Christmas, the day after Christmas in 1863, of a group of 67 indigenous people who they claimed were traitors. You hear this? Traitors to the United States government. Now, can you explain to me how, I can come into your house, chase you out, take your children, and then try you for being a traitor to me? How do you work that? So the law, the hypocrisy, of course, goes on. They hung them at a military site. The second largest, of course, the largest lynching, you say, in this country, of course, was 14 Italians in New Orleans in 1892. They like to cover that up, etc., etc. But my point is that in terms of the theme of this lecture, by the time the Civil War was over, they had another 60 years of hell and misery for indigenous people. Every treaty that had been made, violated and run away, land pushed away. Let me just give you a couple examples. And of course these folks were very slick. They never picked on all these folks at one time, and they never got the message. During that whole period, there was one indigenous brother, Tecumseh. Him, and to a less extent, Pontiac. But Tecumseh was a visionary. He had the concept of unifying all of the indigenous people, regardless of whatever subgrouping they belonged to, etc., and coming together and making one big thing to push these Europeans out. Now, this is the latter half of the 18th century. The problem was that, like so many people, including us, the argument, well, we can work with these folks, and why do I need to do this? Or you got some kind of plan, and you want to be boss. In the meantime, what was happening to them? All right? Once they got to the point where they felt they had it in control, then they came out with the classic example. The example of people like so-called Chief Joseph. But remember, like Africans, the Indians didn't have chiefs. They had kings and wasn't like everybody else. But Europeans can't deal with other folks being kings. Now, what we had, the chicanery, the hypocrisy, the thieving, the lying still goes through. From the beginning, one of the main tricks, they used two things in terms of genocide. Jefferson encouraged his people to get the Indians drunk and get the land from them. Lord Jeffrey Amherst sold them blankets impregnated with smallpox. We don't know to this day how many indigenous people were carried away by this, but you got to remember this. It had to be significant because, like us, the indigenous folks here, as the Africans and the Asians, had no experience with these diseases, smallpox, syphilis, etc., etc. So therefore, they hadn't built up any immunity to them. So once you got infected, I mean, even colds, they died like flies from pneumonia. These are outdoor people being pushed inside, etc., etc. So it was obviously deliberate. It didn't take long for folks to see what the effect was. And we have the words of Thomas Jefferson, of Jeffrey Amherst, of J.M.K. Polk. These folks didn't hide. After all, they were cock-walk. That the easiest way to solve our Indian problem. What was the saying? The only good Indian is a dead Indian. All land not occupied by Europeans is empty. I'm not making this up. All land not occupied by Europeans is empty. Other thing is, the Indians don't own the land. God put them here as caretakers to take care of it until we came to get our inheritance. Now, very quickly as we wind down, the old man's getting a little winded, but I don't want to leave you hanging halfway. Now let's look at how this worked out. They were always smart enough to not, as I said, go up against all, play one against the other. The Plains, so-called Plains Indians, the Arapahoes, the Sioux, and by the way, you must look at these so-called, these names very carefully. Because the word Sioux is a European word meaning snake. So you're talking about the Oglala Sioux, the Essex Sioux, these folks. These people did not call themselves by these names. Then we look at the people who tried to work with the folks. Let's take a look at the guy they call Chief Joseph. They named him. And he was the head of the group of Indians the Europeans called the Perse, P-E-R-C, accent aigu over the E, Nez, N-E-Z, French for pierced noses. Now you can imagine a whole group of people calling themselves pierced noses, right? For whatever, but that was the name the French hung on them. Joseph was a kind man, a hospitable man like so many of us, and he thought, in spite of the advice of many of his counselors, that he would eventually be able to find a way of dealing in a meaningful, civilized manner with these Europeans. Again, these folks didn't know about what I just read to you, about how these folks were living and smelling dog shit, etc., you know? So he kept making deals, and these folks kept pushing him off his land. He spent 12 years trying to avoid fighting with Europeans. He went out of the upper portion of this country into Canada 8 times, trying to get away from fighting these people. And in the end, he says, there's no avoiding you people. You are crazy. Now, he's ready to make his stand. Obviously, by this time, where's most of his strength? He's gone. So we need, I think, to look and understand that. Then the other thing, it's like Tecumseh's brother, Sakuzri, said to the guy who came for treat, to talk about treaty. He says, no, I can't deal with you because, yeah, you speak with forked tongue. He says, it's interesting that whenever you win with us and we have a fight, it's a great victory. If 100 of us beat 2,000 of you, it's a massacre. Yeah. You know, when the hell, and he asked, when do we win? One legitimate. No answer. But we know that Tecumseh and the rest of these people moving. Now, it wasn't just this. We know that the thing that did the East Coast indigenous people in, and it's ironic because the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Creeks, the Cherokees, and the Seminoles are basically the same people ethnically. But Mr. Andrew Jackson was able to set up a deal with John Ross, people of the Creeks, and then he fought. The Creeks says, we're not going to give up our land. So in Alabama, Georgia, Florida, they fought like hell. But then the Cherokees says, we want peace. We trust these folks. The Europeans had said to them, you see, you people are violating God's orders, his wishes. The Bible says, go forth and multiply over the earth. And you folks are hunters and gatherers and not agriculturalists, so therefore, you're violating one of God's basic rules. The Cherokee figured, okay, I can live with that. So in Georgia and other places, in Alabama, they came up with Sequoia. He invented an alphabet. They learned farming, agriculture. And they have joined with Andrew Jackson and his flunkies to help beat up on the Creeks and the Seminoles. Chased them out of Georgia. Of course, the Seminoles ended up down in my home state, down in Florida, where they are still, quote unquote, on the federal list. The Seminoles are still listed as fugitives from the United States government. I thought you'd like to know that. Now, that fight happened in 1837. Now, we, of course, as you're aware, are related to the Seminoles because the Seminoles intermarried with black folks. They became refuges for our folks who escaped across the border. Remember, Florida then was, of course, so-called Spanish territory. So our folks from Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina, if we made it across into Florida, the Seminoles would give us sanctuary. We intermarried with them, etc., etc. So the Seminoles, now, as we speak, the Florida Seminoles, if you see a group of them, they vary in complexion just like we do in this room. And then another group of them went up the west coast of Florida to a place which is about 40 miles from Rosewood. You know Rosewood, the place where they went and murdered and massacred all our folks. Well, there was a place about 4 miles on the Gulf Coast called, they named it Negro Fort. This was still in Florida, and the Seminoles and the Africans were doing well, minding their own business. Mr. Andrew Jackson decided that these folks had no business there, that they represented a threat to the United States, and without a declaration of war, he did an Iraq on them, except that he didn't have no smart bombs or stealth bombers, and moved in by land and sea without declaration of war and wiped out pretty close to 3,000 people, a whole fort. We don't know exactly how many. But the idea was to get rid of us because we represented a threat to their slave property across the border in the so-called United States. So much for democracy and freedom, and we hold these truths, of course, to be self-evident. But now when we come going back to the end of the Civil War, once again we are caught in a bind because our people, no job, we got nothing from the end. So many young men who had been in the Army went out and joined the 9th and 10th Cavalry out in the Midwest, Kansas, etc., etc. And the job of the whole point then was to come up with a final solution to what they considered their Indian problem, that is to wipe them out. And they didn't care how they did it. 1864, under the presidency of Mr. Abraham Lincoln, there was a general in charge of the volunteer army called Colonel John Chivington, Chivington. And this is the thing that's known in history as the Sands Creek Massacre. Even they called it a massacre. And Mr. Chivington's fort was to sneak up on an indigenous people community when the men of the fighting age were away, and then slaughter whoever he found. And when he went into the Sand Creek community and found the men, of course, were away, he slaughtered something like what they said, 3,000 or 4,000 people, men, women, children, and babies. And when one of his troops said, "Why are you killing the babies?" he stated, "Nits grow up to make lice." Now, so we, unfortunately, bear a part of this responsibility because it was the 9th and 10th Cavalry were the shock troops for this stuff. The 1876, the June 26 thing of Custer's last stand. I don't understand how they could call it a last stand because Mr. Custer was out on what they call today a search and destroy mission. He went out looking for indigenous folks to kill. He couldn't wait. People, that's right, people warned him, and these folks took him. So when it all ended, he was dead. And like I always call the O.J. Simpson case the modern Custer case because these folks can never let it go. No. They've done at least 20 movies, a variation of Custer's Last Stand. They even came up with movies that 3 people survived, and all this garbage, right? Right? But whether you survived, they were gone. But in any event, Custer, as I said, everyone got. And of course, ultimately they got Sitting Bull, they got Red Cloud, because either you prepared to go to the death. Now, let's see what happened now to the Cherokees. The Cherokees, Georgia, Floyd, whatnot, helped them do in the Creeks, who they called the Red Sticks. And now, after the Creeks were no longer a threat, the Seminoles had now moved down into the Florida Everglades, into the swamp with the snakes and whatnot. President Andrew Jackson, et cetera, then decided to issue a decree, what led to the Trail of Tears, that all the indigenous people with Cherokee east of the Mississippi would have to depart and go west to Oklahoma, and there they would have a whole new land which would be theirs as long as the sun shone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of the Cherokees who had been a leader and his friend by the name of, the leader of Cherokee, by the name of John Ross, who had hung out with Andy Jackson, drunk with him, whored around with him, all this stuff, when he saw the order, he couldn't believe it. Now, what was the issue? The issue was the Cherokees in Georgia had become farmers, and their farms were valuable and prospering. But again, they didn't know the history of these folks. I just read you these people sleeping on the straw mat people, and that they're land crazy. So when the whites saw what they were doing, they said, we want this land. So the state of Georgia passed a law evicting the Cherokees off their land, alphabet and all. John Ross and, of course, Andrew Jackson said it must go. The Cherokees, of course, by this time, they're civilized, right? So-called part of the civilized 5 or 7 tribes. So what do? They say, hey, we'll go to court. Take it all the way to the Supreme Court. And Chief Justice John Marshall found in their favor. When President Andrew Jackson got a copy of the ruling, he looked at it contemptuously, told him, says, how many troops does John Marshall have? He's made a decision, now let him enforce it. They're going. John Ross rode horseback all the way from Georgia to talk to his old buddy, Andy. Andy boy met him, so he said, yeah, John. And John reminded him past favors, how they had fought, shows this shows. As a matter of fact, John had saved his life by killing a Creek who was getting ready to split Andy's head open. He reminded Andy that, and Andy says, I know all that, but I'm not prepared to violate the rights of one white man for all the Indians in America. So you better go back and tell your people, you're going. Damn what the Constitution says. So now he had a precedent. What did Thomas Jefferson do with the Louisiana Purchase? All right. As a result of this, of course, this led to the Veil of Tears. We will never know how many human beings died, old people on that trail going into Oklahoma. Suffice it to say that the states through which the trail go now, they have now come up with a tourist thing. Can you believe this? Georgia and the other North, they got a tourist thing now where you can go and go to trail where the trail, they ain't got no shame. My grandma used to say the bucker ain't got no shame. And that ain't changed. So they have now come up with a whole building cabins and tourist thing along the way where you can get a guide who will teach you, and this was after so many died, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, naturally, the people are not making any money. So now you throw these people out in Oklahoma, et cetera, where they run up against people who were out there before, who don't know they're being chased, and all they can see is these new usurpers coming to grab their land. So you now create what? Animosity and fighting between the Arapahoes, the Cheyennes, et cetera, et cetera. But thank God, in a way, was lucky, because this was 1837. This land, it was supposed to happen by 1885. We made another mistake. We need this land. We're going to open up the Oklahoma Territory to settlers. I like that, settlers. See, if you ain't white, you're not a settler. You ain't white, you just a usurper. You are what they call a squatter. They had previously done the same thing to the Sioux about the Black Hills. You can have this as sacred ground, you can have it in perpetuity. And then some sneaking mountain men went in and discovered gold. Once again, the federal government went and rapped off, ignored the treaty. Now, these are the folks who are always calling you criminals, and your children are criminals. They're doing this and that and the other. But ultimately, they brought people from all over the country, some from just off the boat from Europe, lined up on the Oklahoma border, and at a certain shot, the man with a starting gun fired off a pistol, and the rush was on. You got as much land as you could grab. Now, you might well say to me, yeah, but this was land that two seconds ago, historically, you had said to the indigenous people you could have things forever. Yeah, well, so much is forever in a day. Now, as we look at this and look at the whole concept of missed opportunities, etc., the question then arises, unless we are prepared to look at, and I've got some of these books, and we see, I've dealt with the histories, the part histories of at least 20 different indigenous people groups. And they're all the same story, only the names have changed to protect the guilty. Now, the question then arises, and we'll look at that in depth next week, because this is not a thing for that. We are lucky to be here, in a sense. The indigenous people who they thought were going to disappear, some subgroupings have disappeared, but their tribe is increasing. These people are now, in the person of people like Vine Delory and others, are now writing their own story. As a matter of fact, Vine Delory wrote a book, boy, that made people mad. The title of the book was "Custer Died for Your Sins." And he addressed that to the white folks. So you know they love that book. You know, and say whatnot. But that is a part of the process of where we, of course, will be moving. And the thing is, for us, as I see it, we have not really learned, enough of us, the lessons from the past, the assumption on our part. And believe me, I am a firm believer in working with people wherever you can. What do you do? Not a dilemma. When you're dealing with the people who refuse, who will only sign agreements until they're strong enough to do you in. Yeah. Let's say, you say, well, that's different. Let's take one quick look at Iraq. Yes. And of course, the first thing they do is demonize your leaders. Yes, sir. Castro, Martin, doesn't matter, Malcolm, whoever, you know, and Paul Robeson. You know, Fannie Lou Hamer, or, you know, they always make you into the demon. Now you take a quick look, and most people aren't. Now here is an example. One of the so-called cradles of civilization is Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. And ancient Mesopotamia is today's Iraq. So out of Iraq came the Hammurabic Code, which, of course, the corruption came in the Ten Commandments, etc., etc. All of these things go back. The concept of law, as we know it, goes back to that period. We know the world of Nebuchadnezzar, etc., etc. A rich tradition in art and culture, mathematics, science. And what does Mr. Clinton call these people? Barbarians. And they also had the nerve of saying the Iraqis love us. They are glad that we are bombing them. This is a quote from last week. They're glad we're bombing them because we are going to help them get rid of Saddam Hussein. May I ask, did Saddam Hussein shoot himself into power? No. The Iraqi people put him in, thank you, ma'am. And so, absolutely, you're right. Now, nobody even bothers to say Iraq had been a part of the Turkish Empire, and when they ripped up the Turkish Empire, the Western world, the United States and the Brits moved in and grabbed it. When they discovered oil, they had a problem. Kuwait has historically been a part of Iraq. All right. The Brits cut it off from Iraq because they did not want the Iraqis to have access to a port in the sea because they were looking to dominate naval and whatnot their route to the jewel in the crown, India. Now, when oil comes in, and then here comes little brother of the United States, you got a whole thing. When the Turkish Empire fell apart at the end of World War I, then they came to their other little semantics. Well, we got to have some mandates. They created an artificial country called Yugoslavia, which is now kicking them in the face. They cut Rwanda and Burundi up, and now they blame it. All of this stuff. In other words, they did the same thing in Africa that they had done. Wherever they go, just cutting this thing up. Now, from 1918 to 1940, these folks, the England controlled Iraq, so the Iraqis got their freedom. Now, you tell me why the hell it is the United States supported Iraq, gave them arms, etc., as long as they were fighting Iran. But you need to understand something about ethnicity in these cases. The Iraqis and the Iranians are Muslims, but ethnically the Iraqis are Arabs. The Iranians are Parsi. They are connected with the people or Indian, whatnot. So there is a long tradition from the time of Alexander the Great of example of hostility there. And then by 1900, when the United States and Britain went and got a Cossack, this is the latter, they got a Cossack out of the steppes of Russia and put this Cossack on the throne of Iraq, on the peacock throne, and he ruled as the Shah. This man, of course, was the father of this last flunky that they had, and saying who died and got the word through. Now, none of these people had anything to do ethnically, whatnot, or culturally with the Iranians. Nobody, of course, tells you this. So now, we have the same problem. 1982, when the Iraqis were about to complete a nuclear fission plant, the Israeli made what they like to call a preemptive strike. This ain't terror, and they bombed it and destroyed it. Now, the problem that the Iraqis have, like the problem we all have as Africans, is the Europeans have always been careful in their dealings with other people to the extent that they could to make sure that your manufacturing capacity, particularly as it comes to arms and armaments, has been non-existent. The one thing that did the indigenous people here, they never had any manufacturing infrastructure. And they learned, knowing you learn to shoot weapons, you learn from it, but you didn't have access to make your guns. So where did the guns come from? They could only get their guns from greedy renegade whites who sold them guns at a high price to make money, but and they had no bullets. So that meant that every time they fought a war, their reserve ammunition was less and less. Meantime, these people got manufacturing capacity here. You're importing arms from Europe and whatnot. So what does this tell you? All you have to do is to last that long, right? And they're still doing investigation. By the time of the so-called last war, they had already invented the Thompson and the Gatling gun. Too late to help with the Indians, but they used it to great effect against us, amongst the Matabele people in South Africa, etc., etc. When we come in next week, children, we will start with overview. Thank you so much, but I think that's enough for one time. I don't want to spy y'all.
Sisters and brothers, very quickly before you leave, it is very important that you observe the date today, February 21st, the 34th anniversary of the murder of Malcolm X.
Mm-hmm.
So I just ask you to take one quiet moment.
Mm-hmm.
Please. Thank you very much.
We will have a question and answer period
Next week, yeah.
with the end of the next week. Please, those of you I want to come in, hope you will, I know you somebody to make notes as quick as you can, so if there are things you need to be stretched out, I will be glad to do so. I thank you all very much. You're a good group, and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Let me have books in the back.
Yeah, there are books to be sold in the back, and we need the money so we can get more books to get more underhanded stuff for y'all.